Marcus Chen had learned to recognize the sound of expensive heels clicking against gym floors at 5:47 a.m. Most people who worked out before sunrise wore sneakers, but Amanda Rodriguez wore designer workout gear that probably cost more than his monthly rent. He'd been watching her push herself past exhaustion for 3 weeks now, ignoring every safety protocol he'd tried to explain during their initial consultation. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. She treated the gym like another boardroom to conquer, another challenge to dominate through sheer willpower and caffeine. The crash came on a Tuesday morning, when Chicago's downtown fitness center was nearly empty except for the usual early risers. Marcus was adjusting weights near the free weights section when he heard the distinct sound of someone hitting the floor hard. Amanda had collapsed mid-representative during what looked like her 4th consecutive set of deadlifts, her face pale and her breathing shallow. Her designer water bottle had rolled across the rubber flooring, spilling its contents of what smelled like pure espresso mixed with protein powder. Marcus moved without thinking, his emergency response training from his paramedic days kicking in automatically. He checked her pulse, elevated her legs, and called for the front desk to contact emergency services while keeping his voice calm and professional. Amanda's eyes fluttered open just as the paramedics arrived, confusion replacing the usual sharp focus he'd grown accustomed to seeing. She tried to sit up immediately, already reaching for her phone to check messages, but Marcus gently but firmly kept her lying down until the medical professionals could evaluate her properly. The paramedics determined she was severely dehydrated and running on about 3 hours of sleep combined with too much caffeine and not enough actual nutrition. They recommended immediate medical attention, but Amanda refused transport to the hospital, insisting she had a board meeting in 2 hours that couldn't be rescheduled. Her assistant appeared within minutes, armed with backup phones and a tablet displaying what looked like 17 different urgent notifications. Marcus watched this dance of corporate crisis management with growing concern, recognizing something familiar in Amanda's desperate need to maintain control even while her body was literally shutting down. Marcus had built his quiet life in Chicago deliberately, choosing the pre-dawn shift at Elite Fitness because it kept him invisible. Most members at that hour were focused on their own routines, too tired for conversation or questions about his background. He preferred it that way. The gym was clean, well-equipped, and located in a high-rise building downtown, where the membership fees ensured a certain type of clientele who valued discretion and efficiency over small talk. His apartment was a 20-minute walk away in a neighborhood where single fathers weren't unusual, and nobody cared about his past as long as he paid rent on time and kept his 8-year-old daughter Emma quiet during school nights. Emma attended the local elementary school, where she'd quickly made friends with other kids whose parents worked unconventional hours. Marcus had structured their entire life around predictability and safety, 2 things that had been in short supply during his previous career as a paramedic in Detroit. The trauma that had driven him from emergency medicine to personal training wasn't something he discussed, even with Emma, who only knew that Daddy used to help people who were hurt, but decided he wanted to help people stay healthy instead. She accepted this explanation with the easy adaptability of children, more interested in whether he'd remembered to pack her favorite granola bars for lunch than in understanding the complex grief that had reshaped their lives. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Marcus had been working the early morning shift for 8 months when Amanda Rodriguez first walked through the glass doors of Elite Fitness. Even at 5:30 a.m., she looked like she'd stepped out of a business magazine, her workout clothes coordinated and expensive, her hair pulled back in a style that probably required professional maintenance. She moved through the gym with the same purposeful energy she likely brought to corporate boardrooms, treating exercise equipment like business tools that needed to be mastered and conquered. During their initial consultation, Marcus had tried to establish reasonable goals and limits, but Amanda had dismissed most of his suggestions with the polite efficiency of someone accustomed to getting her way. She wanted maximum results in minimum time, preferably before her first conference call at 7 a.m. She had no interest in rest days, recovery periods, or the gradual progression Marcus recommended for someone who'd spent the last 5 years prioritizing work over physical health. Amanda Rodriguez was 34 years old and had been CEO of Rodriguez Consulting for 2 years, having inherited the position when her father stepped down due to health issues. The company specialized in corporate restructuring, helping struggling businesses streamline operations and eliminate inefficiencies. It was work that required decisive action, long hours, and the ability to make difficult decisions without emotional attachment. Amanda had excelled at these requirements, growing the company's client base by 40% since taking over and earning recognition as one of Chicago's most promising young executives. But success had come at a cost that Marcus could recognize, even when Amanda couldn't. She arrived at the gym every morning looking like she'd already been working for hours, checking emails between sets and taking calls during what were supposed to be rest periods. Her nutrition consisted primarily of coffee, protein bars, and whatever catered meals were served during her endless series of business meetings. She treated sleep like an inconvenience and weekends like opportunities to catch up on projects that hadn't fit into her regular workweek. Marcus had seen this pattern before, during his years as a paramedic, in high-achieving professionals who pushed their bodies past reasonable limits until something gave way. He'd tried to address it diplomatically during their training sessions, suggesting modifications to her schedule and emphasizing the importance of recovery time. Amanda had listened politely, and then continued following her own agenda, treating his expertise like helpful suggestions rather than necessary guidance. The morning she collapsed, Marcus had been watching her with growing concern for 20 minutes. She'd arrived 15 minutes late, already agitated about some crisis that required constant phone monitoring. Her usual warm-up routine had been abbreviated to almost nothing, and she jumped into heavy lifting while still responding to text messages. When he'd approached to suggest reducing the weight or taking a longer break between sets, she'd assured him with practiced confidence that she knew her own limits and could handle the intensity. Marcus had learned not to argue with clients who were determined to ignore professional advice, but something about Amanda's situation felt different. Maybe it was the way her hands shook slightly when she thought no one was looking, or the dark circles under her eyes that no amount of expensive concealer could completely hide. Maybe it was the desperate edge to her efficiency, as if she was running from something that would catch up with her the moment she slowed down. Whatever it was, Marcus found himself staying closer than usual, ready to intervene if her stubborn determination finally exceeded her body's capacity to cope. When Amanda hit the floor that Tuesday morning, Marcus felt the familiar surge of adrenaline and focus that had once defined his professional life. But this time, instead of racing toward an ambulance with a stranger's life in his hands, he was kneeling beside someone he'd been watching struggle for weeks. Someone whose relentless drive reminded him uncomfortably of his own past mistakes, when he'd believed that working harder and sleeping less was the solution to problems that couldn't be solved through sheer force of will. Amanda's refusal to go to the hospital had created an awkward standoff in the gym lobby. Her assistant, Jennifer, hovered nearby with 3 different phones buzzing simultaneously while the paramedics packed their equipment with obvious reluctance. Marcus found himself in the uncomfortable position of being the only person present who seemed genuinely concerned about Amanda's immediate well-being rather than her corporate obligations. When the paramedics finally left after making Amanda sign multiple liability waivers, Marcus made a decision that surprised even him. "You're coming with me," he told Amanda, whose legs were still shaky despite her insistence that she felt fine. "Just for a few hours, until you can stand without swaying." Amanda started to protest, citing her packed schedule and urgent meetings, but Marcus cut her off with the same tone he'd once used to manage crisis situations in ambulances. "Your assistant can reschedule your morning. Your body just shut down completely. You need food, water, and rest, in that order." Jennifer, who had been frantically texting what Marcus assumed were damage control messages, looked up with surprise. "Mr. Chen, I don't think Ms. Rodriguez's schedule allows for," but Amanda raised a hand to stop her, studying Marcus with the same analytical expression she probably used during board meetings. After a long moment, she nodded slowly. "Cancel everything until 2 p.m., she told Jennifer. "Tell them I'm dealing with a family emergency." Marcus's apartment was a 15-minute drive from the gym, located in a tree-lined neighborhood that felt worlds away from the glass towers of downtown Chicago. Amanda sat silently in the passenger seat of his 10-year-old Honda, looking out the window at the modest houses and corner grocery stores with the fascination of someone visiting a foreign country. Marcus wondered when she'd last been in a vehicle that wasn't a luxury sedan or corporate car service, when she'd last seen neighborhoods where people hung laundry on front porches and children rode bicycles on sidewalks. The apartment itself was small but comfortable, decorated with Emma's artwork and filled with the organized chaos of a single parent's life. Soccer cleats by the front door, homework assignments held to the refrigerator with magnets, a stack of library books on the coffee table waiting to be returned. Amanda stood in the living room taking in these details with obvious bewilderment, as if she was trying to decode the logic of a life she'd never encountered before. "When was the last time you ate actual food?" Marcus asked, guiding her to the kitchen table and pulling out a chair. Amanda considered the question with the same seriousness she probably applied to quarterly budget reviews. "I had a protein bar around 4 a.m., she said finally. "And coffee, several cups." Marcus shook his head and started pulling ingredients from the refrigerator, ingredients for the kind of breakfast he made Emma on weekends when they had time to sit together without rushing. Scrambled eggs with vegetables from the farmer's market, whole grain toast, fresh orange juice, and coffee that wasn't strong enough to power machinery. Simple food that required attention and care to prepare properly. Amanda watched him cook with intense focus, as if she was studying a process she'd heard about but never witnessed. "I usually eat breakfast meetings," she explained when Marcus set the plate in front of her. "Catered events where you talk business while someone serves you things you don't really taste." The first bite seemed to surprise her. She chewed slowly, paying attention to flavors and textures, in a way that suggested this level of mindful eating wasn't part of her usual routine. Marcus poured himself coffee and sat across from her, watching her discover what food could taste like when it wasn't consumed as fuel during multitasking sessions. "This is really good," Amanda said, and her voice carried a note of genuine amazement that made Marcus smile despite himself. "It's just eggs," he said, but Amanda shook her head. "No, it's not just eggs. You put thought into this. Time and attention. I can't remember the last time someone cooked for me like this." The admission seemed to surprise her as much as it surprised Marcus. He'd made breakfast for hundreds of people over the years, mostly Emma, but occasionally friends or neighbors who needed looking after. It had never occurred to him that preparing food with care was something unusual or noteworthy. As Amanda ate, color gradually returned to her face and her hands stopped trembling. Marcus made a mental note that her collapse had probably been building for weeks, her body operating on reserves that had finally been exhausted. "Tell me about your daughter," Amanda said suddenly, gesturing toward Emma's school photos on the refrigerator. "She looks like you, but happier." Marcus laughed at the unexpected observation. "Emma's 8 going on 30. She's got opinions about everything and the energy to enforce them. She's at school right now, probably trying to convince her teacher that they should do math problems about horses instead of abstract numbers, because horses are more interesting." Amanda smiled, a real smile that transformed her entire face and made her look years younger. "She sounds wonderful. Does she know about your previous job?" Amanda's question was casual, but Marcus sensed the deeper curiosity behind it. He'd mentioned during their training sessions that he'd worked in emergency medicine before becoming a personal trainer, but he'd never explained the transition or the reasons behind it. "She knows I used to help people who were hurt," Marcus said carefully. "That's enough for now. The details aren't appropriate for 8-year-olds. Amanda nodded with understanding that seemed to come from personal experience. "My father never talked about the difficult parts of running a business when I was growing up. I thought being a CEO meant sitting in nice offices making important decisions. I didn't understand about the pressure or the isolation or the way success can become its own kind of prison." Her voice carried a weight that suggested recent discoveries about the gap between perception and reality. Marcus refilled her orange juice and studied her face, noting the way her shoulders had begun to relax and her breathing had deepened. "What made you want to take over your father's company?" he asked. "It's not an easy industry, corporate restructuring. You're basically paid to deliver bad news and make unpopular decisions." Amanda considered the question while finishing her eggs, her expression thoughtful rather than defensive. "I thought I was good at fixing things," she said finally. "In college, I was the person everyone came to when their projects were falling apart or their study groups weren't working. I could look at complex problems and find solutions that other people missed. When my father started having health issues, taking over the company felt like the natural next step. a chance to apply those skills on a larger scale and help businesses that were struggling to survive. Marcus heard the past tense in her explanation and wondered what had changed her perspective. "But it's not what you expected?" he asked gently. Amanda set down her fork and leaned back in her chair, looking more relaxed than he'd ever seen her at the gym. "The work itself is satisfying," she said. "I'm good at identifying inefficiencies and developing strategies to address them. But I didn't anticipate how isolating it would be. When you're the person making decisions that affect hundreds of jobs, you can't really have friends in the traditional sense. Everyone wants something from you, or has an agenda, or is trying to position themselves for advancement." The loneliness in her voice was something Marcus recognized from his own experience, though his isolation had come from different sources. "Is that why you work such long hours?" he asked. "Because there's nowhere else you particularly want to be?" Amanda looked at him with surprise, as if he'd asked a question she'd never considered before. "I work long hours because there's always more work to do," she said, but her tone suggested she was testing the explanation rather than defending it. "There's always more work to do in any job," Marcus pointed out. "The question is whether the work you're doing is making you happy or just keeping you busy." Amanda was quiet for a long moment, staring out the kitchen window at the small backyard where Emma's swing set stood waiting for afternoon play sessions. "I can't remember the last time I thought about whether I was happy," she admitted. "Happiness feels like a luxury I can't afford right now." Marcus stood to clear their plates, but Amanda reached out to stop him. "Let me help," she said. "I want to learn how to do this." She meant washing dishes, but Marcus sensed she was talking about something larger, the simple act of cleaning up after a meal, of participating in the ordinary maintenance of daily life, rather than having everything handled by assistants and service providers. They worked together at the sink, Marcus washing and Amanda drying, falling into an easy rhythm that felt surprisingly natural. Amanda asked questions about everything: why he used a particular brand of dish soap, how he'd learned to cook, whether Emma helped with household chores, what they did together on weekends. Her curiosity was genuine and intense, as if she was studying a lifestyle she'd heard about but never experienced firsthand. "Emma and I have pancake Saturdays," Marcus explained, handing Amanda a clean plate to dry. "We make breakfast together and then plan our weekend adventures. Sometimes it's the zoo or a museum, sometimes it's just reading books at the library or building blanket forts in the living room. The point isn't what we do, it's that we do it together without schedules or objectives or productivity goals." Amanda absorbed this information like she was memorizing it for future reference. "That sounds incredibly peaceful," she said. "I haven't had a Saturday without business obligations in over 2 years. Even my vacations include conference calls and email check-ins." Marcus watched her carefully fold the dish towel when they finished, taking time with the simple task in a way that suggested she was savoring the novelty of unhurried domestic routine. "What would you do with a completely free Saturday?" Marcus asked as they moved to the living room. Amanda settled onto the couch with visible relief, as if sitting down without her laptop or phone felt like a revolutionary act. "I honestly don't know," she said. "I've been working toward goals for so long that I'm not sure what I actually enjoy doing for its own sake. When I was younger, I used to paint watercolors, mostly landscapes, and still life compositions. But that was before I understood that hobbies were supposed to be networking opportunities or resume builders." Marcus sat in the armchair across from her, noting how different she looked in his living room compared to the corporate environments where he usually saw her during their training sessions. Smaller somehow, more human, as if the expensive clothes and carefully maintained professional appearance had been a kind of armor she was finally able to remove. "Do you still have your art supplies?" he asked. "Somewhere in storage, probably," Amanda said, "along with my guitar and my collection of books that aren't related to business or economics. I packed up most of my personal belongings when I moved into my current apartment because there wasn't space for anything that didn't serve a professional purpose." The matter-of-fact way she described dismantling her own interests made Marcus understand something important about the life she'd been living. "What kind of apartment doesn't have space for books and art supplies?" he asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Amanda's laugh was rueful rather than amused. "The kind that's designed to impress clients and business partners, rather than be lived in by an actual person. Everything is white and minimalist and perfectly staged. It photographs well for magazine features about successful young executives, but it doesn't feel like home." It feels like a hotel room I'm renting indefinitely. Marcus thought about his own space, cluttered with Emma's projects and filled with mismatched furniture that had been chosen for comfort rather than style. Nothing in his apartment would photograph well for magazines, but every object told a story about their life together, held memories of ordinary moments that had accumulated into something meaningful. "When did you last feel at home somewhere?" he asked. The question seemed to catch Amanda off guard. She was quiet for several minutes, staring at Emma's artwork on the walls with an expression Marcus couldn't quite read. "College, maybe," she said finally. "I had a dorm room junior year that I decorated with posters and plants and all the books I was reading for pleasure rather than assignments. My roommate and I would make tea at midnight and talk about everything except our future careers. It was messy and chaotic and completely impractical, but it felt like mine in a way that nowhere has felt since." Marcus understood then that Amanda's carefully controlled life wasn't just about professional success or family expectations. It was about fear of the vulnerability that came with creating spaces and relationships that reflected her actual preferences rather than her projected image. "What happened to that roommate?" he asked. "Are you still in touch?" "Sarah Chen," Amanda said. And Marcus smiled at the coincidence of sharing a surname with someone who had clearly been important to her. She became a teacher and moved to Portland. We exchanged Christmas cards for a few years, but then I got too busy, and she probably got tired of hearing about my career achievements instead of my actual life. I miss her sometimes, the way she can make me laugh about things that felt overwhelming. The admission carried a loneliness that made Marcus want to offer comfort, but he sensed that Amanda wasn't used to accepting emotional support from people who weren't paid to provide it. Instead, he told her about his own experience with friendships that had been casualties of career transitions and life changes. "I lost touch with most of my paramedic colleagues when I left Detroit," he said. "Not because we stopped caring about each other, but because I couldn't talk about why I'd left without reliving things I wasn't ready to process. It's hard to maintain relationships when you're not sure who you are anymore." Amanda looked at him with recognition and gratitude, as if he'd articulated something she hadn't been able to name. "That's exactly it," she said. "I became someone who was good at being a CEO, but I'm not sure that person has anything in common with who I used to be or who I might want to become. It's like I'm wearing a costume that I can't figure out how to take off." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, both processing the unexpected intimacy of sharing honest observations about their respective forms of self-imposed exile. Marcus found himself wondering when he'd last had a conversation this genuine with another adult, when he'd last felt safe enough to acknowledge his own uncertainties about identity and purpose. Amanda seemed to be thinking along similar lines, studying his face with the same attention she'd brought to learning his breakfast preparation techniques. "Thank you," she said eventually, "not just for this morning, but for the last few weeks. I know I haven't been the easiest client to work with, and you've been more patient than I deserved." Marcus shook his head, recognizing in her gratitude the same isolation that had driven him to structure his life around predictable routines and minimal emotional risk. "You don't owe me thanks for treating you like a human being," he said. That should be the baseline, not something extraordinary. But even as he said it, Marcus realized that both of them had been living in environments where genuine care and attention were so rare that they felt remarkable when encountered. They'd both built lives that prioritized safety and control over connection and authenticity. And neither of them had understood the cost until this moment of unexpected intimacy in his modest living room. 3 weeks after the morning Amanda collapsed at the gym, Marcus began to notice subtle changes in her routine that made him uneasy. She arrived earlier than usual, sometimes at 5:15 instead of her typical 5:30, and lingered longer after their sessions, finding reasons to extend their conversations about nutrition, recovery techniques, or Emma's latest school projects. Her workout intensity remained concerning, but now it seemed driven by something different than pure professional ambition. There was a restlessness in her movements, a distraction that suggested her mind was elsewhere, even while her body went through the familiar motions of strength training and cardio. Marcus had started looking forward to their sessions in ways that felt professionally inappropriate and personally complicated. Amanda had begun sharing details about her work that went beyond simple scheduling conflicts, telling him about difficult client situations and family pressure that reminded him uncomfortably of his own struggles with expectations and responsibility. She asked about his daily routine with Emma, about the neighborhood where they lived, about his decision to leave emergency medicine for personal training. These conversations felt more intimate than anything Marcus had experienced since his wife died, and that intimacy created its own form of anxiety. When Amanda mentioned casually that she'd been thinking about taking art classes or maybe learning to cook properly, Marcus found himself offering to teach her basic techniques during their off hours. When she expressed curiosity about Emma's school activities, he suggested she might enjoy attending one of the weekend soccer games where parents gathered to cheer and share coffee from thermoses. These invitations felt natural in the moment, but afterward Marcus questioned his motivations and wondered if he was crossing boundaries that existed for good reasons. The revelation came on a Thursday morning when Amanda arrived at the gym visibly agitated, her usual composed demeanor replaced by an energy that felt dangerous and unpredictable. She threw herself into her workout with an intensity that surpassed even her previous concerning levels, ignoring Marcus's attempts to moderate her pace and dismissing his suggestions for rest periods with sharp efficiency that reminded him of her corporate persona. When he finally insisted that she stop mid-set, concerned about her elevated heart rate and obvious emotional distress, Amanda snapped. "I found the reports," she said, her voice carrying a fury that Marcus had never heard from her before. "The surveillance reports that my father commissioned. 3 months of detailed documentation about where I go, who I talk to, what I do during my personal time, including every conversation we've had, every minute I've spent at your apartment, every detail about Emma's schedule and your background." The words hit Marcus like physical blows, each revelation worse than the last. Amanda pulled out her phone and showed him photographs that had clearly been taken without their knowledge or consent. Marcus leaving the gym with Amanda after her collapse. The two of them walking to his car. Amanda sitting at his kitchen table eating the breakfast he'd prepared. Emma playing in the backyard while Amanda watched from the kitchen window during a weekend visit that had felt spontaneous and natural, but had apparently been documented for some unknown purpose. My father hired a private investigation firm to monitor my activities because he was concerned about my, quote, declining professional focus and wanted to identify potential distractions or security risks. Amanda continued, her voice shaking with anger and humiliation. "They've been following me for months, but they intensified their surveillance after I started spending time away from the office during morning hours. They know everything about you, Marcus. Your previous employment history, your financial situation, Emma's school and activities, even your reason for leaving Detroit." Marcus felt his stomach drop as the implications became clear. Not only had their privacy been violated in the most comprehensive way possible, but Emma had been drawn into surveillance she never consented to, photographed and investigated simply because her father had shown kindness to someone who needed help. The violation felt personal and professional simultaneously, threatening both his carefully constructed quiet life and his daughter's safety and privacy. "They think you're either trying to manipulate me for financial gain or that I'm having some kind of breakdown that requires intervention," Amanda said, scrolling through additional documentation on her phone. "The report recommends either terminating my access to you or finding ways to discredit your professional reputation to prevent further contact. My father is considering both options, depending on how I respond to his concerns about my recent behavior changes." Marcus understood then that their growing connection had been observed, analyzed, and categorized as a threat to Amanda's professional effectiveness and family loyalty. What had felt like the beginning of genuine friendship or possibly something deeper had been reduced to a security risk that needed to be managed or eliminated. The intimacy of their conversations, the domestic comfort of shared meals, the easy affection Emma had developed for Amanda during her weekend visits, all of it had been documented and interpreted as evidence of manipulation or instability. "So what happens now?" Marcus asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Amanda's expression combined determination with resignation in a way that reminded him of clients who'd made decisions they didn't want to explain or defend. "My father wants to meet with you," she said, "officially, to discuss your professional relationship with me and establish appropriate boundaries for future interactions. He's framing it as a business consultation, but it's really an evaluation to determine whether you're a problem that needs to be solved." Marcus felt his protective instincts surge in ways that had nothing to do with professional training and everything to do with the growing care he felt for Amanda as a person rather than just a client. His immediate impulse was to refuse the meeting, to help Amanda find ways to maintain her independence without subjecting herself to family manipulation and control. But even as these thoughts formed, Marcus recognized the pattern from his own past, the way his desire to protect and rescue had contributed to his wife's death, when he'd made decisions about her safety without consulting her preferences or respecting her autonomy. "You want me to meet with him?" Marcus said, making it a statement rather than a question. Amanda nodded, but her expression suggested the decision was complicated rather than simple. "I want you to understand what you're dealing with before you decide whether our friendship is worth the complications it's going to create," she said. "My father isn't just protective, he's strategic. He spent his entire career identifying threats and neutralizing them efficiently. If he decides you're a negative influence on my professional performance, he'll find ways to make your life difficult that you probably haven't considered." Marcus thought about Emma, about the stability they'd built in Chicago, about the quiet life that had allowed them both to heal from losses that had seemed insurmountable. The idea of exposing their peaceful existence to corporate warfare and family manipulation felt reckless and potentially dangerous. But the alternative, walking away from Amanda when she was clearly struggling with isolation and control that mirrored his own past experiences, felt like abandonment rather than wisdom. "What kind of complications are we talking about?" Marcus asked, though he suspected the answer would be comprehensive rather than specific. Amanda's laugh was bitter rather than amused. "Background checks on your emergency medicine credentials, inquiries about your reasons for leaving Detroit, questions about your financial stability and parenting capabilities, professional complaints filed with certification boards, concerns raised with Emma's school about your associations, reviews of your tax records and business licensing. Nothing illegal, just thorough enough to make your life extremely uncomfortable." The thoroughness of the potential harassment made Marcus understand that Amanda's family operated with resources and connections that could affect every aspect of his and Emma's lives. This wasn't just about losing a client or dealing with professional inconvenience. It was about protecting his daughter from consequences that would result from his decision to care about someone whose life was more complicated than he'd realized. "He's done this before," Marcus said, recognizing the systematic approach that suggested experience rather than improvisation. Amanda nodded with obvious reluctance. "3 times that I know of. A college boyfriend who my father decided was more interested in my trust fund than my personality. A business school study partner who he thought was trying to steal my academic work for his own advancement. A colleague at my first job who he believed was using our friendship to gain access to confidential client information. In each case, he was probably right about their motivations, but his methods were extreme enough to end the relationships completely." Marcus understood then that Amanda's isolation wasn't just the result of professional demands and family expectations. It was the consequence of systematic interference that had eliminated potential connections before they could develop into genuine relationships. Her loneliness was curated rather than accidental, maintained through surveillance and intervention that ensured her emotional energy remained focused on family and business obligations, rather than personal fulfillment or independent relationships. "So you've never been allowed to have friends as an adult," Marcus said, the realization carrying implications that made him angry on Amanda's behalf and concerned about his own situation. "Not friends, not romantic relationships, not mentors or colleagues who aren't somehow connected to family business interests. Your father has been controlling your social connections for over a decade." Amanda's expression confirmed his assessment, while also revealing her own growing awareness of the pattern. "I told myself it was protection," she said, "that he was helping me avoid people who would take advantage of my position or use me for access to family resources. But I'm starting to understand that the protection was actually isolation, designed to keep me dependent on family approval and guidance, rather than developing my own judgment about people and relationships." The conversation that followed was the most difficult Marcus had experienced since leaving Detroit. Amanda explained the choice she was facing: submit to her father's demands for a supervised meeting where Marcus would be evaluated and their relationship would be formally limited to professional training sessions, or maintain their friendship and face the systematic harassment that would likely destroy the quiet life he'd built for himself and Emma in Chicago. Marcus found himself caught between competing instincts and responsibilities. His desire to protect Amanda from family manipulation conflicted with his need to protect Emma from consequences she didn't deserve. His growing feelings for Amanda as a person, rather than just a client, made him want to fight for their connection, But his experience as a single father reminded him that some battles created casualties that weren't worth the potential victory. "I can't ask you to risk Emma's safety and stability for my personal problems," Amanda said, voicing the conclusion Marcus had been reluctant to reach himself. "And I can't continue spending time with you, knowing that it's putting your family in a position where they might be harmed by my father's need to control every aspect of my life. The responsible thing is for me to find a different trainer and for us to end our personal relationship before it creates serious consequences for people we care about." Marcus wanted to argue, to insist that they could find ways to maintain their connection without exposing Emma to potential retaliation. But his professional experience with crisis situations reminded him that good intentions didn't always translate into good outcomes, and that protecting the people who depended on him sometimes required making choices that felt like personal failures. The decision Amanda was proposing felt like abandonment, but it also felt like the kind of sacrifice that responsible adults made when their personal desires conflicted with their parental obligations. "So we just pretend the last few weeks didn't happen," Marcus said, hearing the bitterness in his own voice and not caring about professional appropriateness anymore. "We go back to trainer and client, polite conversation about workout routines and nutrition plans, no personal information shared or genuine connection acknowledged. You find ways to deal with your family situation without support from people who actually care about your well-being as a person rather than your performance as a CEO." Amanda's expression showed that the plan hurt her as much as it hurt him, but her determination suggested she'd already made the decision and was committed to following through regardless of personal cost. "It's not what I want," she said, "but it's what makes sense given the realities of my situation and your responsibilities to Emma. I can't be the reason your daughter's life becomes complicated or unsafe. I care about both of you too much to let my problems become your problems." Marcus recognized the logic even as he hated it, understood that Amanda was making the same kind of protective decision he'd made when he left emergency medicine to keep Emma safe from the emotional toll of his previous career. But the similarity didn't make the choice feel less like failure or betrayal, didn't make walking away from someone who needed support feel like anything other than the kind of abandonment he'd sworn to avoid after losing his wife. The conversation ended with arrangements for their final training session the following week, a professional conclusion to a relationship that had begun to feel personal and meaningful in ways that neither of them had anticipated or prepared for. Marcus watched Amanda leave the gym that morning knowing that he was unlikely to see her again outside of their formal goodbye, and the knowledge felt like another form of loss that he wasn't sure how to process or explain to Emma, who had started asking when Miss Amanda would visit again and whether she might want to see the new drawings she'd been working on at school. Emma noticed the change in her father's demeanor before Marcus realized how obvious his disappointment had become. She started bringing him extra drawings from school, pictures of stick-figure families with carefully labeled members that always included Miss Amanda, even though Amanda hadn't visited their apartment in over a month. During their Saturday morning pancake routine, Emma would ask casual questions about whether Amanda was still learning to cook, or if she'd found time to paint pictures like she used to when she was younger. Marcus tried to answer these questions without revealing his own sense of loss, but 8-year-olds possessed an uncanny ability to detect emotional undercurrents that adults tried to hide. Emma began leaving small gifts around the Ball's apartment, hand-drawn cards with messages like, "I hope you feel better soon, Daddy," and carefully arranged flowers from their backyard that she claimed were just because pretty things make people happy. Her thoughtfulness made Marcus realize that his attempt to protect her from adult complications had been less successful than he'd hoped. The catalyst for change came on a Tuesday evening when Marcus was helping Emma with homework, and she asked why grown-ups sometimes stopped being friends with people they really liked. The question was prompted by a story problem about sharing cookies, but Emma's serious expression suggested she was thinking about more complex social dynamics than elementary mathematics. Marcus set down the pencil he'd been using to check her work and gave her his full attention. "Sometimes adults make decisions based on fear instead of love," he explained, choosing words carefully while trying to remain truthful about emotional complexity. "They worry so much about protecting people they care about that they forget to ask those people what kind of protection they actually want or need." Emma considered this explanation with the gravity she brought to all important conversations, her small face scrunched in concentration. "Like when you quit being a paramedic because you were scared something bad might happen to me too?" she asked, demonstrating the perceptiveness that continued to surprise Marcus, even after 8 years of parenting a remarkably intuitive child. "But I was never scared of your job, Daddy. I was proud that you helped people who were hurt. Maybe Miss Amanda isn't scared of her daddy being mean to us. Maybe she wants to decide for herself what risks are worth taking." The wisdom in Emma's observation hit Marcus with unexpected force, making him realize that his decision to accept Amanda's protective choice had been another form of the same pattern that had driven him from Detroit to Chicago. He'd spent so much energy trying to shield both Emma and Amanda from potential consequences that he'd forgotten to consider whether they wanted his protection or preferred to face challenges with his support rather than his absence. That evening, after Emma had gone to bed, Marcus found himself standing in his kitchen, thinking about the breakfast he'd shared with Amanda weeks earlier, remembering the wonder in her expression as she discovered what food could taste like when prepared with attention and care. He thought about the conversations they'd had about loneliness and identity, about the way she'd listened to his stories about Emma with genuine interest rather than polite tolerance, about the comfortable silence they'd shared while washing dishes together. Marcus realized that walking away from Amanda hadn't protected anyone from anything meaningful. Emma was still asking about her, still creating artwork that included her as part of their family unit, still hoping for visits that weren't going to happen. His own work had become mechanical rather than engaging, his interactions with other clients professional but distant in ways that reminded him of the emotional numbness he'd experienced after his wife's death. Most importantly, Amanda was still dealing with family manipulation and isolation, without the support of someone who understood her situation and cared about her well-being as a person rather than her performance as a CEO. His protective distance hadn't solved her problems or reduced her stress. It had simply removed one source of genuine connection from her life during a period when she needed support most. The next morning, Marcus made a decision that felt both impulsive and inevitable. Instead of waiting for Amanda to arrive at the gym, he called her office and asked to speak with her directly. Her assistant Jennifer recognized his voice and put him through with the efficiency of someone who'd been expecting this call for weeks. When Amanda answered, her voice carried surprise mixed with something that might have been relief. "I've been thinking about what Emma said," Marcus began, not bothering with professional pleasantries or careful explanations. "About how sometimes adults make decisions based on fear instead of love, and how maybe the people we're trying to protect would rather face difficulties with our support than face them alone. I think we made a mistake, Amanda. I think we let your father's threats scare us into abandoning something that was important to both of us." Amanda was quiet for a long moment, and Marcus could hear the sounds of her office in the background, phones ringing and conversations happening, and all the corporate activity that had filled her life before she discovered the possibility of genuine connection. "I've been thinking the same thing," she said finally, "but I'm not sure how to fix it without putting you and Emma at risk. My father hasn't changed his position about our relationship, and his capacity for making life difficult hasn't diminished." Marcus had anticipated this concern, and had spent considerable time thinking about alternatives to simple avoidance or complete surrender to family pressure. "What if we approached this differently?" he suggested. "Instead of letting your father control the terms of our relationship, what if we invited him to understand what he's actually trying to eliminate? Not through a formal meeting where he gets to evaluate and judge, but through transparency that makes it harder for him to maintain fictional narratives about our connection and motivations." The proposal that followed was more complex than anything Marcus had ever attempted in his personal life, but it felt more honest than protective distance or confrontational defiance. He suggested that Amanda invite her father to observe their training sessions, to meet Emma in casual settings where her personality could speak for itself, to see firsthand the domestic routine that had helped Amanda discover aspects of herself she'd lost during years of corporate focus. "You want me to introduce my father to our life instead of hiding it from him," Amanda said, understanding the strategy even as she expressed doubt about its feasibility. The theory being that direct exposure to who we actually are will be more persuasive than surveillance reports about who he thinks we might be. Marcus could hear the hope in her voice competing with skepticism born from years of experience with her father's protective instincts. "The worst thing that can happen is that he decides we're exactly the threat he thinks we are," Marcus pointed out. "But at least his decision will be based on actual information rather than assumptions and interpretations. And Emma gets to meet him as a person rather than as an abstract source of potential danger." Maybe your father isn't as unreasonable as his methods suggest. Maybe he's just a parent who's been trying to protect his daughter using strategies that made sense 20 years ago, but don't fit your current situation. Amanda agreed to the plan with a mixture of determination and terror that Marcus remembered from his own decision to leave emergency medicine and start over in a new city with a grieving child and uncertain prospects. They arranged to meet the following Saturday at a neighborhood farmers market, a public setting casual enough to feel non-threatening but structured enough to provide natural conversation topics and time limits that would prevent the encounter from becoming overwhelming for anyone involved. The meeting exceeded Marcus's expectations in ways he hadn't dared to hope for. Amanda's father, Robert Rodriguez, arrived prepared for confrontation, but found himself disarmed by Emma's immediate and enthusiastic interest in his stories about growing up in Mexico and learning to run a business in a language that hadn't been his first. Emma showed him her latest drawings and explained her theories about why vegetables tasted better when you picked them yourself, engaging him in the kind of genuine conversation he probably hadn't experienced in years. Marcus watched Robert's expression change as he observed the easy affection between Emma and Amanda, the way they collaborated on selecting produce and negotiating with vendors, the comfortable dynamic that had developed between his daughter and this child who clearly thought Amanda was one of the most interesting adults in her world. By the time they'd finished shopping and were sharing coffee at a picnic table overlooking the river, Robert's defensive posture had shifted into something that looked like curiosity. The conversation that followed was honest in ways that surprised everyone involved. Robert explained his concerns about Amanda's professional focus and family obligations, his fear that personal relationships would distract her from responsibilities that affected multiple generations of family security. Amanda described her growing understanding of the difference between professional success and personal fulfillment, her need for connections that valued her as a person rather than as a CEO or daughter. Marcus talked about his own experience with protective decisions that had created isolation rather than safety, about learning to distinguish between reasonable caution and fear-based control. Emma contributed observations about friendship and family that demonstrated the kind of emotional intelligence that comes from being raised by a parent who discusses feelings honestly rather than avoiding difficult conversations. By the end of the afternoon, they'd reached an understanding that felt sustainable rather than temporary. Robert agreed to end the surveillance and interference in exchange for regular opportunities to spend time with Amanda and Marcus as people, rather than as security concerns requiring management. Amanda committed to maintaining transparency about her personal relationships while establishing clearer boundaries about family involvement in her private decisions. Marcus promised to include Robert in Emma's activities when appropriate, creating opportunities for genuine relationship rather than suspicious observation. The arrangement wasn't perfect and would require ongoing negotiation and adjustment, but it represented a foundation for moving forward together rather than apart, with honesty rather than secrecy, with support rather than control. 2 years later, Marcus found himself standing in the converted warehouse space that housed Rodriguez Chen Wellness, watching Amanda lead a workshop for executives who wanted to learn sustainable approaches to high-performance living. The business had grown from a casual conversation about helping other people find balance into a thriving consulting practice that combined Marcus's expertise in physical health with Amanda's understanding of corporate pressure and family dynamics. Emma, now 10 and proudly serving as their unofficial social media manager, documented the workshop with the same careful attention she brought to her school photography projects. She'd become an expert at capturing moments when clients experienced breakthroughs, when their faces showed the recognition that success didn't require sacrificing health or happiness. Her portfolio had evolved from stick figure drawings to sophisticated compositions that somehow managed to convey the emotional transformation that was central to their work. Amanda had legally changed her name to Amanda Chen Rodriguez, honoring both her family heritage and her chosen partnership with Marcus, while maintaining her professional identity in ways that felt authentic rather than performative. The hyphenated name reflected the integration she'd achieved between her corporate skills and her personal values, between family loyalty and individual autonomy, between professional ambition and domestic contentment. Their client list included CEOs who wanted to learn meal planning, single parents who needed strategies for combining career advancement with family responsibilities, and adult children of controlling families who were seeking independence without complete estrangement. Each case taught them something new about the universal human need for connection that honored individual identity rather than suppressing it for the sake of external expectations. Robert had become an unexpected asset to their business, bringing decades of entrepreneurial experience and a network of contacts who trusted his judgment about worthwhile investments. His relationship with Emma had evolved into genuine grandfather-like affection, with regular Saturday adventures that included museum visits, cooking lessons, and long conversations about everything from business ethics to butterfly migration patterns. Marcus still worked early morning shifts at Elite Fitness, but now his training sessions felt like extensions of the wellness practice rather than separate employment. Clients who wanted more comprehensive lifestyle changes often transitioned from individual training to the integrated programs he and Amanda had developed together. The work felt meaningful in ways that simple exercise instruction never had, addressing the root causes of stress and imbalance, rather than just their physical symptoms. The warehouse office included a comfortable living space where Emma could do homework after school, surrounded by plants Amanda had learned to grow successfully, and artwork from clients who discovered creative outlets they'd abandoned during years of professional focus. The space felt like the home Amanda had never been able to create in her sterile corporate apartment, lived in rather than staged, functional rather than impressive. On quiet evenings, Marcus would find Amanda in the small kitchen they'd installed, preparing meals with the same attention and care he'd shown her that first morning after her collapse. She'd become an accomplished cook, taking pleasure in feeding people she cared about, and creating the kind of domestic routine that nourished relationship rather than just sustaining individual survival. Their success wasn't measured in traditional metrics of revenue growth or market expansion, but in the stories their clients shared about marriages that had improved when work stress decreased, about children who felt more connected to parents who'd learned to prioritize presence over productivity, about individuals who'd discovered that personal fulfillment and professional achievement could coexist rather than compete. Marcus watched Amanda finish her presentation to enthusiastic applause from a room full of people who'd arrived looking exhausted and overwhelmed, but were leaving with practical strategies and renewed hope. Emma captured the moment with her camera, adding another image to the collection that documented their shared mission of helping people build lives that felt authentic rather than obligatory. Later that evening, as they cleaned up from the workshop and planned the following week's schedule, Marcus reflected on the journey that had brought them from a gym emergency to this integrated life and work partnership that neither of them could have imagined 2 years earlier. They'd built something that honored both their individual strengths and their shared values, something that served other people while fulfilling their own need for meaningful work and genuine connection. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.